Debbie, welcome to the meeting, and thank you for your presentation today on First Nations leadership in the fight against fascism in Australia.
Thank you, and greetings from your Radical Women siblings from Narm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And thanks to National Radical Women for inviting us to honor Indigenous Peoples Day with you. Like the United States, Australia is a settler state, which has grown rich from the repression of First Nations. So both our continents have similar histories of genocide and Indigenous resistance. I'm going to give you a brief background of both of these, and then I'll tell you about the leadership of our First Nations in the fight against fascists and the far right. So in 1935, on the second anniversary of the Reichstag fire, First Nations led a large demonstration in Melbourne showing solidarity with Germany's Jews. In 1938, William Cooper, a leader of the Australian Aboriginal League, led a First Nations delegation to the German consulate in Melbourne to protest the Nazi persecution of Jews and the anti-Jewish pogroms that followed Kristallnacht. So First Nations have a proud history of confronting fascism from its beginning. And there's a reason for this. They're the first in line of attacks by fascists. Fascism's purpose is to protect capitalist interests when it's faced with a working class in revolt. But even before that, the capitalist state protects the wealth built from First Nations stolen lands, resources, and labor by trying to wipe out all physical and cultural traces of their existence. And here are just some examples of genocidal practices in Australia, which would be totally familiar to you. Sterilization and abortion of First Nations women without their consent or knowledge. Child removals, which is still going. First Nations women's imprisonment. Women are the fastest growing sector of Australia's prison population, and nearly half are Indigenous, 80% are mothers. Deaths in custody, as Helen mentioned, which keep rising despite recommendations of the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, which stipulate imprisonment as the last resort. Destruction of birthing sites and other sacred sites by developers and mining companies. Grinding poverty, the disappearance of First Nations women that we don't even have statistics for. So fascists have been marching here in Melbourne behind the banner Australia for the White Man. From its official foundation, Australia had a White Australia policy, which lasted until the 1970s. But unofficially, it's still ongoing, and the genocide continues. Nazis' targeting of First Nations is in this context. Just one harrowing example is their relentless stalking and death threats against Lydia Thorpe, a Gunai Gunditjmara and Jawourn woman, prominent leader of the Black Sovereignty movement and a federal senator. And I'll speak about a more recent example of attack later. So First Nations resistance hasn't stopped since 1788. The Gurindji workers' strike, known as the Wave Hill Walk-Off in 1966 at a cattle station in the Northern Territory for better working conditions, pay, and land rights, is legendary. The 1972 Tent Embassy in Canberra, which is a protest occupation for land rights, sovereignty, self-determination, and an end to deaths in custody, is still going. Melbourne's Invasion Day on January 26, which protests the official Australia Day celebrating Captain Cook's landing in 1788. These invasion days are huge. up to 100,000 and militant, and they're led mainly by young First Nations women. Women are also prominent in the struggle to end the deaths in custody. To this day, while the number of deaths keep rising, no cop has ever been punished. A call from this movement is for elected community bodies with powers to investigate, charge, prosecute, and punish police. And the grassroots group, Grandmothers Against Removals, is formidable. First Nations resistance has always been strongly internationalist. Just as they solidarized with Jews against Nazism, First Nations were in the forefront of the massive organized protests against apartheid in South Africa, and they stand at the front of the Palestinian solidarity movement today. So I'm now going to be telling you about the First Nations leadership in the anti-fascist movement here. And in telling you about it, I'll be covering some ups and downs in the movement as it struggles to meet today's challenge. I'll start with a snapshot of the situation right now. The sharpening economic crisis has given the far right and Nazis the chance to recruit and organize. They feed off government's blaming of unions, refugees, and immigrants, and most recently the anti-Palestinian solidarity movement for our problems. Over the past couple of years, the far right and fascists have zeroed in on young trans and queers, refugees, Jews, First Nations, and now the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. Right now, their rallying cry is "Stop Mass Immigration." Meanwhile, the anti-fascist movement has stagnated. The Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, or CARF, which Radical Women and FSP helped form in 2015, degenerated from a dynamic united front into a loose, left-centered coalition that operates as a front for socialist alternative, or SALT. SALT here comes from the International Socialist Organization tradition. This and the fact that the union movement never acts has pretty much left Nazis targets to fend for themselves, which they've been doing courageously, but without a broad-based united front to back them. All this came to the fore this past August 31st. In cities across the country, well-coordinated far-right and anti-immigration marches for Australia turned out many thousands. Nazis were prominent among them. Melbourne's was the same day and time as the weekly Palestine Solidarity Rally, and it was led by the National Socialist Network, which is the main Nazi group here. August 31st and the two far-right mobilizations that followed within the next 2 months tell us a lot about the anti-fascist organizing right now and the First Nations' importance in it. So on August 31st, the white supremacists significantly outnumbered the Palestinian anti-fascist counter-organization organized mainly by SALT/CARF and Palestinian Solidarity Movement leaders. Our side was caught off guard by the growth and organization of Nazis on the far right and by the intensity of police violence directed at us. Fascists and flag-waving patriots freely roamed around central Melbourne while cops kettled us at every turn. It didn't help that at the beginning, our side had no clear strategy and got divided over tactics. The Nazis finished off the day by attacking Camp Sovereignty, which is a significant Aboriginal cultural site close to Melbourne Centre. First Nations' response to this rout of our side and the attack on Camp Sovereignty was to step in. The Black People's Union called out SALT/CARF for not consulting with First Nations and asserted Aboriginal leadership. 2 weeks later, saw a very different counter-mobilization against the next March for Australia. It was First Nations led and more collaboratively organized. First Nations organized the rally and drew thousands to hear their speakers. And this photo in my background is from this rally. They then led the march to Parliament, where the far right was rallying. This counter-mob was united and upbeat with a tremendous feeling of strength. The massive police formations at Parliament didn't let us get close to the far-right rally, so we couldn't disrupt it or prevent it from marching. But the First Nations leadership provided much-needed direction for future actions. The August 31st rout brought a diversity of activist groups into the anti-fascist organizing. SALT is now working to control this influx and has co-opted the term United Front, which it's not. It's a coalition that remains left-centered. Inclusion is controlled by selective networking, and a committee of reps from a few groups manages it. This coalition organized the second counter-mob, the one with the flags in the background, conceding to First Nations leadership, but it clearly doesn't recognize nor heed that leadership. Just before the third March for Australia, which was last Sunday, division happened between Camp Sovereignty and the organizing committee. It appears that the committee treated Camp Sovereignty leaders with tokenism, and Camp Solidarity challenged this. On the day of this counter-mob, that is last Sunday, Camp Sovereignty speakers took the rally mic, and their message was powerful. They expressed solidarity with all oppressed people and warned the rally that we're the fascists' next targets. They asserted their position as central to unifying and winning the fight to defeat this threat. Camp Sovereignty then led the march to Parliament, which we got to despite heavy police harassment and blockades. At Parliament, police then opened fire on us with OC spray, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, and they advanced on us with their military weapons and riot shields pointed at us. The much smaller far-right rally, which was just a few hundred this time, were then free to march through the city. RW and FSP have argued in the coalition the need to recognize the leadership of First Nations and all frontline targets who know how to defend their communities. And as things turned out last weekend, the left is next. Victoria Police used a few thrown rocks as clear evidence that the left is a violent danger to society. This is the new pretext for passing a bill soon to be presented in the state parliament to crack down on protest, and the cops have warned that they're coming for us. RW and FSP have also raised the need to stand up to cop violence. In Radical Women's international collaboration on these developments, the U.S. leadership stressed the importance of movements protesting police violence. Movements in Australia understand the role of the cops and expect violence from them, but they don't challenge it. In all of Australia, there is no body that investigates police conduct except the police themselves. However, this mustn't stop us from challenging them. So we've incorporated this into our Melbourne anti-fascist organizing. We're pushing the call from the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody movement for police accountability under community control. Radical Women is also currently liaising with the Black People's Union on addressing this at Radical Women's meeting next month. So I'll conclude with our United Front building. We've worked with the Indigenous Social Justice Association Melbourne, which we helped to form and have a decades-long relationship with, and with the Sharps. Sharps stands for Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, which is a group focused on confronting the fash and trains in community defense. Both ISJA and the Sharps are committed to building a united front with us. We've gone to these counter-mobs in joint contingents with ISJA and the Sharps. RW has been holding a study group based on a new book published by the FSP in Australia, The Fight Against Fascism and the Far Right, Voices from the Front Line. And this is bringing in new people, and some have been joining our contingents. They've been experiencing a mini united front in action. So things are moving fast. The crisis is presenting much opportunity to break down long-standing barriers to united front building, and First Nations leadership is front and center in this. And this building is urgent. There will be another far-right rally on November 30th with Tommy Robinson. You might know him as a leading UK fascist, and he's coming to speak. And it'll surely be used to build for January 26, which the Nazis have announced is their next focus. Again, this is the Invasion Day rally. This is where working class solidarity must come out in full force. Our fights are bound together, and the solidarity power needed to rout the Nazis is yelling out for a united front. This January 26th should be a milestone for First Nations and the working class striking together to smash fascism in the egg. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing discussion.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, shall we stop the recording now?